Our scripture text is found in Ecclesiastes, chapter number 3, and beginning with verse number 1. For everything there is a season and a time for every matter under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck up what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw away stones and a time to gather stones together, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to throw away, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. What gain have the workers from their toil? I've seen the business that God has given to everyone to be busy with. He has made everything suitable for its time. Moreover, he has put a sense of past and future into their minds, yet they cannot find out what God has done from the beginning to the end. I know that there's nothing better for them than to be happy and enjoy themselves as long as they live. Moreover, it is God's gift that all should eat and drink and take pleasure in all their toil. May God bless the reading and hearing of this word. May we hear in it a word that is to us and is for us on this very day. If you are a parent or a grandparent or maybe just a movie goer, perhaps you have seen the animated film Finding Nemo. It is the story of a young fish named Nemo who was separated from his family and ended up in the fish tank of a dentist living in Sydney, Australia. Nemo's father, Marlin, endured a very difficult journey to travel to find him and to save him and to free his son. Well, there's a happy ending to it all. He's successful. And as the credits begin to roll, you know that this little family is going to live happily ever after. But even as the credits are still rolling, you learn that a new story, a sequel, is being put into play. They cut from the credits to another scene. The same fish who had helped to free Nemo from the fish tank, they too have now become captives. While their fish tank is being cleaned and they have been placed in little plastic bags, they realize it is their moment to escape. And they roll their plastic bags over, rolling them over the counter, out the window, and finally across the street and into the harbor. When the last one finally reaches the water, there is a collective cheer and a sigh of relief. Then the reality of the situation lands upon them. There they sit in the water, in plastic bags, bobbing up and down. It is Bloat, a pufferfish who was prone to being outspoken, who asked the question which was on everyone's mind: what now? As one year comes to an end and we stand on the precipice of a new year, perhaps that is one of the questions we find ourselves asking. What now? Or another way to ask it would be, what time is it for us? This famous and poetic passage from Ecclesiastes is primarily about time. And I tell you something, friends, I don't think that we talk about time enough in church, for it poses us with some enormous questions, such as how much time do we have left? Now, with the exception of some rare circumstances, we may not know the answer to that question, but there's a follow-up question, perhaps even more important. What do we want to do with the time that we have left? Now, the writer of Ecclesiastes doesn't answer those questions for us, but simply reminds us that we are wise to be paying attention to time. I once was part of a pulpit swap which went on with the same church for years. One Sunday a year, I would go and preach in this pulpit, and their pastor would come and preach in the one that I typically preached in. What made it unique is that the two churches were situated just across the road, catty-cornered from one another. One of the churches was, the church across the road was almost completely African American. Our church was mostly a white congregation. The way we were situated, the pastor and I often crossed paths on that designated Sunday as I walked to his church and he walked to mine. But one of the things going on is that we were learning something about one another's church and church culture and how that church that had existed across the road for 100 years across from one another, the way they practiced it and how they did things differently than we did. One of the things that I noted and really couldn't help but miss was in the back of the church above the door where people came in and then left, there was a clock. Now, I didn't have a clock in the church where I preach generally, so I had some questions about this clock. The placing of the clock produced one obvious fact as it related to preaching in that sanctuary. The only person who could see the clock was the person standing behind the pulpit, which I naturally concluded to mean that the information the clock provided was to be considered by the person standing behind the pulpit. Now, like I said, I didn't have a clock in the church where I normally preach, but I didn't need one. The body language of the congregants and the occasional this, I always knew what time it was. One thing I've learned through the years as a pastor is that this never means I hope this sermon is not ending anytime soon. Well, what was confusing, though, about the clock in the other church on the back of the wall is that despite the clock being there, nobody acted like they were concerned with the time. No song ended unless everybody wanted it to end, because if somebody asked for it to continue, they just kept singing. No prayer ended until everything that needed to be prayed for was prayed for. All of this was refreshing to me. But most refreshing as a speaker is that I never had to wonder how I was doing, because they let me know with encouragement along the way. If they wanted me to keep preaching, they just said, "Preach on." It was a phrase I commonly heard on those Sundays, but one Sunday I finally had to say, "I'd like to, but I don't have anything left to say." After a few years, however, I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to know about that clock. And so I asked one of their lay leaders why it was there when nobody seemed to be concerned about the time. And he said, "Preacher, I hope you didn't give a second thought to that clock. We're never in a hurry to get out of church. But one year we were hanging garland for Advent and a ladder slipped. Fortunately, nobody was hurt, but it left a hole in the wall. Times were tight back then, and the clock was cheaper than a carpenter." Well, it isn't so much that the writer of Ecclesiastes doesn't care about time, as much as it is that that wasn't his purpose. Instead, he conveys the wisdom that there is a time for everything. And that makes this the perfect passage for New Year's Eve. It serves as a reminder that just because something once worked doesn't mean we have to keep doing it if it's not working any longer. And those of us who have occupations like mine and are leaders in a church do well to remember that. Conversely, just because we have never tried a thing doesn't mean that it's too late to try that very thing. And those of us who are living and breathing need to remember that. Life, the writer of Ecclesiastes understood, was not a static thing, nor were the people who live it. The beauty and the challenge of this passage, which refuses to tell us what time it is that it throws open the door for freedom and allows us to determine what time it is for ourselves. Should we be prayerful in deciding what time it is? Yes, we should. Should we be discerning as a community of faith? Of course. But still, there become moments in our lives and the lives that we live together when we must decide about what time it is. German philosopher Erich Fromm once made this observation. He said, most people fail in the art of living not because they are inherently bad or so without will that they cannot live a better life. They fail because they do not wake up and see when they stand at a fork in the road and must decide. Closer to home, but conveying the same sentiment, Charles Chestnut was an essayist and a historian whose parents were born in Fayetteville, North Carolina, not far from here. Among other things, he wrote about the post-Civil War South and the need to work together to build a South in which black people and white people could all flourish together. Regarding the work that must be done, he said, there is time enough, but none to spare. New Year's Day, New Year's Eve, these are not religious observances. And in fact, if it doesn't fall somewhere close to a Sunday, it often comes and goes with little mention of it in church. Perhaps, though, it shouldn't be that way. Perhaps it is people in faith communities who more than any other people should believe in the possibilities of a new year. We should stop and think about what an amazing and hopeful thing it is to embrace the possibilities of a new year. It is fantastically hopeful. We believe that we can change. No matter how deep the ruts in which we might find ourselves, we believe that we can change in small ways and in big ways. We make resolutions and believe that we can break a bad habit or start a new and life-giving habit. We believe that we can get in shape or write a book or lower our handicaps or forgive or let go or love more deeply than we ever have before. Friends, that is amazingly hopeful. And hope is a good thing. According to those who are supposed to know about such things, it only takes 3 weeks for us to become blind to stationary objects in our everyday world. If we hang a picture in our house, we'll notice it for a while, appreciate it, admire it, but pretty soon it just blends in and we don't see it anymore. It is even true for objects which are out of place. It is supposedly true that objects which are where they don't naturally belong, also we lose sight of them. If you leave a screwdriver laying on the coffee table, it will in the beginning look out of place, but eventually it'll just blend in with the coasters and the remote control. But leave it there for just long enough, and it won't be noticed at all. Maybe that is true as well for the walls which divide us as human beings. True of the walls which divide us in our personal relationships, in our relationship with our Creator, our relationships with even entire groups of people. Those walls exist for long enough and They're just there, as if they belong there. But we believe that when December turns into January, those walls which divide us from one another, which divide us from the very best parts of ourselves, even those walls which have existed for so long that we have ceased to see them, we believe that they can be torn down. Friends, that is an amazingly hopeful thing. Hope is a good thing. The cynic in us will point out how many resolutions don't get kept. But hopefully there's another part of us that sees what a wonderful sort of light must exist in the human heart to believe that such things are possible. How much light must exist within us for us to believe that we are capable of change and growth and newness of life. To consider even the possibility of doing great things. Or just as well, doing small things in a great way. Knowing there is time for all things means that if the time comes to rewrite our stories, there is a power within us and among us which allows us to do that very thing. It is said, and it is no doubt true, that people plan and God laughs. Sure, there are often things waiting around the corner which we could not anticipate or know were coming. But it is also true that our destiny, you ever think about a destiny? Our destiny is simply what we decide to do next, with God's help and with one another. That's our destiny. Angela Ying is a pastor who tells the story of Charlie. Charlie was a young boy in her church, and he was one of those children that challenged all the teachers and everyone who worked with him. He kept them on their toes. Being that he was unpredictable, when it came time for the Christmas pageant, they gave Charlie a job that was uncomplicated. He would be the keeper of the inn, with only one line to be repeated 3 times. No room. Charlie was assigned this role because they believed that he could handle it and there would be no surprises. Mary and Joseph did their part and came by looking for a place to stay. And Charlie's voice boomed out, "No room." Banging on the door harder now, the second time, with some desperation in her voice, Mary asked if they had any place for her and her young family. Charlie boomed out, "No room." Now moved to the point of pleading, tears, Mary begged for a room for herself, for her husband and her unborn child. And Charlie at this point couldn't take it anymore. Moved with compassion, he said, "Why don't you just take mine?" Well, I heard y'all saying, "ah," and all that. Unfortunately, the play ground to a halt because there was nowhere else to go now that the family had a warm place to stay. Some of the parents were none too happy about it. They had sunk a lot of money into those Christmas pageant costumes. But those who had come seeking the presence of God, well, they knew that they had found it in a boy who refused to play the part assigned to him and instead chose to do justice and to love kindness and to walk humbly with God. He chose to rewrite the story, making it full of kinder people and a family being good to one another. There are those who would argue that we aren't capable as a human race of living in any other way than in enmity and strife with one another. And on some sad days, I admit that it's hard to argue otherwise. But tonight, as the clock hits midnight, whether we are awake or not, and I highly suspect that Stephanie and I won't be, but as that ball falls in New York City, whether we see it or not, we're invited to do a hopeful thing, aren't we? We're invited to believe in a power which allows us to rewrite the story. Friends, that is an amazingly hopeful thing. And hope is a good thing. Happy New Year. I'm eager with anticipation to see the story that we will write in 2024. I bet we'll be surprised. Amen.